Hello everyone and welcome to the Knowledge Pool, your source for everything regarding the rules of Magic the Gathering. Today we'll be going over one of the commander mechanics that is now evergreen, Goad, because it's usually misplayed or misunderstood. Let's begin. So let's begin with the mechanic breakdown. You will find Goad in some spells and abilities, and they always either target a creature or lure creatures or make you choose a creature to Goad. When you goad something, that means that until your next turn, that creature has to attack and has to attack a player other than you if able. What that means by you is the player that has activated the ability or casted the spell. Is the player that cannot be attacked by the goaded creature. Also, you notice I said goaded. Goaded is a designation, a permanent and have, so that means that a creature, when you resolve an ability with goad, is goaded and has those two combat abilities that we talked about, which is that it has to attack a player other than us and it has to attack. And goad, honestly, here is neither an ability nor a copy of value, so if I clone a goaded creature, it's not goaded that clone. A creature can also be goaded by multiple players, and that creates additional combat requirements. So, what Goad does is essentially creates two combat requirements. One is that a creature must attack if able, and the other is that it must attack a player other than the player who goaded that creature if able. If we try to goad the creature again after we have goaded already once, it has no effect. And it also doesn't create additional command requirements. Now, command requirements is something that people know about without knowing. It's essentially that must you see on creatures. Like creatures that must attack its turn if able or must be blocked creates command requirements. And we're gonna talk about these requirements and restrictions in the next segment. So, command requirements and command restrictions. This is the basic things of the declare attacks and declare block system. So, when we say combat restrictions, we mean the things that say, for example, this creature cannot attack alone, or when this creature attacks, you cannot attack with other creatures. Anything that pretty much would prevent you from doing something, whether blocking or attacking, is considered a combat restriction. A classic example of this are mock flankies, which say that they cannot attack or block alone. So this is a combat restriction. Now, for combat requirements are the things that essentially a creature must do. So a creature, for example, enchanted by Last of War, must attack Fable. That creates one combat requirement because it has to do something. Now, when we try to attack or block with a creature, there is a chance that our attacks or blocks are legal. In order for our attacks or blocks to be legal, we must obey as many requirements as we can, the maximum number, without violating any restrictions. So let's take a simple example. We have 3 grizzly bears as our own creatures, and our opponents attacking with Gorm the Great and a prized unicorn. So in this example we have no combat restrictions, we only have command requirements. Gorm the Great reads that he must block the Fable, so that's one command requirement, and must be blocked by 2 or more creatures if able, so that's another command requirement, that's 2. And prized unicorn reads that all creatures able to block him do so. The interesting part here is that the unicorn actually puts a command requirement for each creature we have, so that is 3 command requirements. Since there are a total of 5 now command requirements, we have to fulfill as many as possible for our blocks to be legal. Now, since we only have 3 creatures, we can only fulfill 3 out of the 5 command requirements. So, the legal blocks here are either all 3 creatures on the prized unicorn, because it's 3 out of the 5, 1 on Gorm and 2 on the unicorn, because again that's 3 out of the 5, 1 of Gorms and 2 of the unicorns, 2 on the Gorm and 1 on the unicorn, because that fulfills 2 for the Gorm, which is must blocked and must block by 2 creature fable, and 1 of the Unicorn. We cannot block all 3 bears on the Gorm because that's only 2 out of the 5 combat requirements, and that's an illegal block because of the maximum amount, which is 3. Of note here, if there is an effect that we have to pay mana in order to attack or block, like for example Propaganda or Prison, we do not have to pay that mana, even though we could fulfill the requirements and the restrictions. If there is a mana payment on the block or the attack, we don't have to pay anything, we can skip the blocks essentially. But here is a very interesting thing because we have to be very careful on the wording of the cards. If something must block Fable and does not read that all creatures must block it, it's only one combat requirement. If it reads like Plies Unicorn that all creatures able to block it must do so, that means it creates one requirement for each creature. Let's take now the same example, but now there is also a silent arbiter on our side of the field. Obviously now only one creature can attack, so let's say our opponent attacks with Prize Unicorn. Now, even though we have 4 combat restrictions because we control the silent arbiter, so that's 4 creatures, only one creature can block its combat. So now the maximum amount of requirements would be 4, but we have a restriction that only allows for one of the requirements to be fulfilled. That means that the block will be legal because we have to account for the maximum amount of requirements without violating any restrictions. And if we try to go over one block, which means fulfilling more than one requirement for the attack, that would mean that we violate the restriction. We cannot violate the restriction under any circumstances. But why all the talk for common requirements and restrictions for Goad? Well, as we mentioned before, Goad creates 2 combat requirements. One of them is that the creature must attack a Fable and must attack another player other than the player that Goad did. Now, let's say we have goaded a creature and we're playing a 4-player game. The other 2 opponents have both propagandas in play. Now, our opponent is not forced to pay any mana, as we mentioned before, for having to attack. So he can say, okay, I will not pay any mana to attack either of my opponents, so I can only fulfill one of the 2 requirements and there are no restrictions, so the creature will have to attack us. Again, because there is no need to pay mana when calculating those requirements or restrictions, he obeys only one of the 2, which is having to attack, and since we are only the available player, it has to attack us. Again, if a player cannot be attacked for some reason, the creature will attack us. So Goad actually works in a 1v1 scenario, but it essentially reads that the creature has to attack if able. And that's really interesting because Goad is supposed to be a mechanic that will protect you from an attack, but it could backfire if everyone has a way to prevent being attacked. Also important here, if our opponent has somehow phased out, like with a Teferi's protection, or cannot be dealt damage, you still have to attack that player. The only way you can get around Goad and force to attack another player is if you cannot be attacked for some reason, because that's a combat restriction if you cannot be attacked. Also really interesting here, let's say we're on a 3-player game, one has been eliminated, for example if we're playing Commander, and both of the players' opponents have goaded their opponent's creature. What happens? Well, now we have essentially 4 requirements, one is the same though, so it doesn't matter. So the creature has to attack, and the creature has to attack different opponents. But again, as we said, we have to obey the maximum number of requirements possible without violating any restrictions. So the creature will actually have to attack one of the 2 players even though it's goaded, because that means that we fulfill the maximum amount of requirements, which is 2 in this case, or 3 if you count the have to attack twice. So if a creature is double goaded and there are no other players that have not got to attack, the creature gets to attack wherever it wants, which is very interesting. Let's see an example again. Let's say we're on a 3-player game, we have no creatures, other than a silent arbiter, and our opponents have 2 grizzly bear seeds. We play disrupt the core and pass a turn. What happens? So we see that all creatures are goaded. That means that each creature has 2 requirements on it. Well, there is also one restriction, which is silent arbiter. So it's turn 2 player's turn, and he has the grizzly bears that are goaded and have to attack. What are the legal attacks? Well, obviously only one of the 2 grizzly bears has to attack, and has to attack the other opponent. That's again very interesting because we have 4 requirements for attacking, but we have a restriction that only allows one of creature to attack. So that means that the maximum amount of requirements for free, unfortunately, is 2, so only one creature will be attacking. Now, if the opponent had a propaganda or the ghost prison in play, because we are not forced to pay mana cost in order to attack, that means that the opponent has the option to not attack that third opponent, but if he chooses not to, he has to attack us with one of the grizzly bears, because again we have to obey the maximum amount of requirements without violating any restrictions. And if we choose not to pay mana to attack someone with ghost prison or propaganda, we still have to obey the other requirement, which is attack if able. So that's everything you need to know about Goad. It's a relatively simple mechanic, but it has some neat intricacies in it. But those intricacies have most to do with how combat requirements and restrictions work. I did a brief mention of combat requirements and restrictions, and I will do a separate video on that segment specifically, because there are some very interesting cases which could come up in Commander, especially with Goad being an evergreen keyword officially announced, for Commander at least, and it creates sometimes confusing situations as to what we have or have not to do here. Thank you all very much for watching. Hope you learned something that you could use in your Commander game the next time someone plays Goad cards, or if you have a Commander that Goads, and see you in the next video.